traditional systems just don't work anymore. They don't actually know what's going on. And so they kind of just bring down the hammer without having enough details, right? And government just tends to move slow. We will continue to see founders and startups move away from, only seeking VC money.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you again at another issue of Stobox Interview. My name is Boris Pikalov. I am co-founder and head of business analytics at Stobox. And our today's guest is Maureen Murat. Maureen is an adjunct professor at UNH School of Law, where she teaches blockchain and cryptocurrency law. She's also attorney advisor of financial legislation and a principal at Crowdfunding Advisor, a firm that advises businesses on starting when they are small. Maureen, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Okay, please tell our viewers about yourself and your activities, what you're engaged in.
You gave a great introduction already. In terms of about myself, I'm from Miami, Florida. My family is from Haiti. And so I think a lot of my, how I see the world and my work ethic comes from that background. So I appreciate that. In terms of my, where I am now, I'm based in Washington, D.C. And my activities, there are a lot, you named a few, but I also, with Crowdfunding Advisors, in addition to advising people on equity crowdfunding and business strategies and all that, my partner Samson and Williams and I, we also put on these masterclasses, these crowdfunding masterclasses. Obviously, we haven't had one in a little while because of the pandemic, but we put on these masterclasses that go along with our workbook, the Raising Money Crowdfunding Workbook. So that's another one of my activities. So for now, what we've been doing is just doing little podcasts and videos and all that to kind of get the information out. And we hope to be able to do masterclasses again soon.
Thank you for your reply. Actually, we had another interview with Samson about crowdfunding, and he was the one to introduce you to us and recommend you as a guest to an interview. So,
nice.
You are based in the US. Could you tell us more about advantages and disadvantages of the US for doing business in security tokens and crypto?
Sure. So I think there are advantages in the US in the sense that in terms of interest and the availability of money essentially to invest in crypto tokens and all that is something that can't be slept on. And I think another advantage is the fact that we have such wide ranging ways to actually participate in a token type of a security token industry. I mentioned crowdfunding. Crowdfunding is one of those ways, and there are different ways to crowdfund where a token can be part of that campaign. Additionally, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, has recognized the fact that there are people who want to use tokens as a means to invest in small businesses. Obviously, and then I guess on the other side of the advantages are the disadvantages, because there are always some. And one of those disadvantages is that when it comes to regulating the crypto token or security token investments, it can be a little difficult for the regulators to kind of understand, where these investors are coming from and where the issuers, the companies who are seeking these investments, where they're coming from as well. And so I think when that happens, sometimes because of that misunderstanding, the regulations or the enforcement actions that come behind it seem to come off as either unfair or ill-informed, or maybe just essentially they don't actually know what's going on, and so they kind of just bring down the hammer without having enough details. But I still think the US is a good place to invest in these types of financial assets. I think the regulators, the different players in the community, and people who are advocating for security tokens are all kind of involved, and I think communicating with each other a little more now, so that it can be something that everyone can participate in.
Yeah, you mentioned the issue that Even though regulators recognize the fact that small businesses want to use tokens as a means of fundraising, they're really concerned about the origins of businesses and investors. And this is especially prominent in applications such as decentralized finance. And the problem is that every time a new technology emerges, such as firstly we had ICOs, then security tokens, then DeFi and yield farming, each time the regulation lacks. And now when there is DeFi, we only start regulating ICOs, which have ended actually several years ago. So given the fact that whatever you're doing now, regulation will come for you only in 2 or 3 years, what should you do as a business, as an innovator, to adapt to basically to a future legislation and not to end up in jail when doing something innovative in finance?
Right. Well, so we don't want anybody to go to jail. I agree. But you raise a really good question, because oftentimes if there's no specific regulation to something, regulating some sort of activity, sometimes, the position of the person doing the activity is that, well, there are no regulations that say you can't do this or that as it relates to cryptocurrencies or digital assets. So that must mean we can do it. And that's not how lawyers, I'm a lawyer, I know we talked about this, and that's not how regulators think, right? They think, okay, we have all these rules that are already in place. Which one of these rules could apply to this type of activity, regardless of what the business calls it? If the activity looks like something that's already regulated, most times the regulator will try to apply that reasoning to it, whether it makes sense or not. And one of those things is the Howey test. Not to say that doesn't make sense, but the Howey test was really derived from an orange grove in Florida, right? So to the average person, it might not make sense to compare that type of business to a crypto asset. But the SEC, essentially they have a test to determine what is a security and what does that mean when it comes to investing. And so they remove all the facts about the orange grove and all that and put those elements to the test. Does it meet these certain things? Now, for a business who's trying to figure out like what can they do and not do, to try to avoid any issues in the future, I think one of the things to do is to definitely be mindful of what rules exist today. So whether or not they have any cryptocurrency implications, although we know there are rules coming about now, but based on their business model, based on their industry, if there are no rules specific to what they're doing, I would suggest still researching the industry to learn what rules apply in that industry, crypto or no crypto, right? And then in addition to that, if investments in your business is part of your business model or part of your roadmap, then I would look into what would make the most sense in terms of when you bring on investors. So regardless of what you're offering investors, there are certain things you have to tell them before they invest so that they can make an informed decision. It doesn't matter what kind of business you're running, doesn't matter if you're using, the most innovative technology known to man. So long as you are bringing in people who are putting their money towards a cause with an expectation of, profit, then there are things you have to tell those people before they put their money in. Another thing I would say about small business or businesses who are thinking about DeFi and tokenizing all these different assets is to really also consider like the purpose behind why you're doing it. I think a lot of times because the terms are so hyped up and they're so popular, it seems like, well, if they're doing it, I should do it too. Not everything is for everybody, and not every way to raise revenue or raise capital is this going to be the same for every business either. So I think research, DYOR, is the best way. Do your own research is the best way to kind of prepare yourself to be ready for if there is something that comes up from a regulator or someone who's saying that you're doing something that's not right. You come prepared with your reasoning why you did it this particular way, and be open to flexible, right? Things change, as you can see, the way that the crypto community and just the way that things are even going, like you said, from ICO to STO and TGEs and everything, they change very quickly. So you have to be aware of these different changes and be ready to adapt if you need to. I'll say that. But I also want to mention, I know I'm an attorney, but I am not giving legal advice. I should have said that in the beginning. These are just my thoughts. Just my thoughts on things. I don't want you to say, Maureen said this, and then you run with it. Definitely get other input.
In the end of the day, everything boils down to doing your homework and being ready to everything.
Yes.
And coming to more details, could you tell us which specific pieces of legislation businesses should consider between working in the US if they are working with crypto, with tokens, with DeFi, etc.? What are the most essential laws?
So there are different agencies, especially in the US, that have some jurisdiction or have some say in how we interact with these crypto assets and DeFi. So one, we already mentioned the SEC. They regulate securities and investing in businesses. And then we have the CFTC, the Commodity Future and Trade Commission. They regulate derivatives and commodities. And based on the CFTC, they've considered Bitcoin and Ethereum commodities. There are people who don't agree with that assessment. I get it, but that's what it is, at least as of right now. There's the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. Their position on crypto is that it really depends on how it's being used. If you're holding on to it, if you're a hodler, right, and you're holding on to it for a long period of time or short period of time, it's considered property initially. And, based on how long you hold it, that will determine what tax liability or tax obligation that's applied to that type of property. But if someone is paying you to do work with cryptos, then it could be considered income. So there are different ways in how they consider those types of assets. And then we'll also look at FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. They really look at how these assets are moving online to really make sure that there's no money laundering or illicit activity happening online. So all of these agencies have put out bulletins and different works to really, or writings to really give you an idea of how they see these different crypto assets. Granted, some of them, you read them and you still have questions, or maybe you have more questions than when you started. I remember the IRS put out a Q&A last year talking about airdrops and how they consider airdrops in some instances to be income or property. But, it also seemed like some of those questions didn't really answer the question posed, but they just felt like they needed to give you something to go with. And I think that, going back to my earlier point, now that these legislators and people are engaging the community, I think the laws and the regulations that will come out later, I guess, will be a little more thoughtful and hopefully not, trying to stifle all this innovation that's happening right now.
Yeah, who could thought only a few years ago that regulators will use the words like airdrops in their regulatory guidance, as things are really evolving fast, but not as fast as everybody would like. And in terms of speaking about this, just a few days ago, I saw in news that SEC put a separate fintech division and separated it from the corporate finance division. So, on your opinion, which impact will this have? Will the regulations start evolving faster? Will we see them more permissive or less permissive? What are your thoughts?
That's a good question. When I first saw that, I thought that was interesting because there are fintech divisions in other agencies, right? When it comes to banking and finance. So I thought it was interesting that they, wanted to have their own fintech or a separate fintech division. I don't know if it will really increase the speed with which we'll see new legislation and new guidance. I think that the division, is probably still very small. Even the crypto division within the division of finance was very small. So to move it out, I don't know if that means they're trying to grow it and expand it and add more people, which would be good, I think. But at the same time, that takes time too, right? To bring on the people that they would want and need to help them move this initiative forward. I don't want to sound skeptical, but it is government, right? And government just tends to move slow. And it's not because, I mean, part of it is because of bureaucracy, right? A lot of times when these regulations have to go through, it takes a long time to actually get through all the people who have to be part of it. They also make time for the lobbyists and all these different interest groups to also provide comments, et cetera. So, that's also part of the delay. And then on top of that, let's say, like the SEC voted recently to update the Reg CF rules and increase the amount of money people could raise and made some other amendments and adjustments, but it doesn't become effective until 60 days after it's been placed on the Federal Register. So it's been a couple weeks now and hasn't been placed on the Federal Register. So it probably won't be placed on the Federal Register until, let's say, later this month or next month. And then 60 days after that, it'll become effective. So, the process in terms of how these different regulations become effective when they're finally final is a very long process, even without the back and forth on the Hill and things like that. So I say all that to say, I don't think that the things are going to move faster. I think that in the long run, that means this new division means that the decisions and the guidances that they give out will probably be more thoughtful, which I think is better than coming out with with new law fast. I think having thoughtful legislation is a much better thing to have than just to have regulations coming out fast.
You're definitely right. And we've seen a much harmful regulation that was done in the wrong way. The example is actually Malta, because it's not only about regulation. In Malta, the regulation was not bad by itself, but in the implementation, it's stifled. Because even they had actually two divisions. One was the Ministry of Digital Innovation.
Right.
We all collaborated with them somewhat, and they were quite supportive towards innovation. But also they were Financial Services Authority, and they had around 1,000 license applications, from which they approved only one or two in 2 years. So
Wow.
definitely being thoughtful about implementing all the processes matters at all. And I know you don't give legal advice and things like that, but the question I have is about one of the particular pieces of legislation in the US, which actually keeps many utility token issuers and exchanges. We see not so many exchanges work actually in the US investors because of the money transmitter laws under the Bank Secrecy Act, which requires spend like millions of dollars and several years to get licensed in every US state. So I've been just wondering, is there a way for an exchange or a utility token issuer to work with US investors without going through such a complicated process?
That is a great question. I think the issue with the money transmitter laws around the country, one, they're all very different. Every state requires something different, which is why if you want to be like a Coinbase, right? You have to register in every state, or maybe not Coinbase. I don't know if Coinbase is the right, a Circle or some other exchange. So I think, and to your point, I'm not giving legal advice. It's very hard to really say there's a way around it, because the issue with the Bank Secrecy Act, it was implemented to make sure that people who are moving money, whether online or through a bank or through a financial institution, are not trying to launder that money, that money didn't come from, illicit practices or illegal activity, and then you're trying to kind of clean it by running it through the banking system or another financial system. And so as a result, they came up with these different rules, including the money transmitter rules, stating that, you had to register your money service business with the federal government and then go on to the different states and follow their different laws. So I think if we look at what the point of the law was, then we can kind of extract from that, why maybe not all the time makes sense, but why they would prefer or exchanges that are issuing utility tokens that are easily exchangeable into fiat, that they would want to regulate those activities. The other issue with that is, the Bank Secrecy Act also wants there to be like a closed loop. So if money is being sent to someone online or any other, through a wire or something like that, the financial institution has responsibilities too, right? They have to be able to tell where the funds came from and where they went, and report and be able to report on that, because they're subject to examinations by the federal government, depending on which bureau they're a member of. So the issue with that is a lot of these banks, like if you are an exchange and you are connected with a bank to help you move the funds in your exchange, that bank has responsibilities that are kind of outside of the relationship that they have with you, the exchange, right? Unless you're going to become a bank, and but the OCC, the Comptroller Office of the federal government, they are working on a fintech charter, which allows fintech companies, which I think presumably includes crypto exchanges, to get a fintech charter. So you have like a type of permission to operate just for fintech companies. So I think that's one way, the federal government, these different regulatory agencies have said, okay, well, it doesn't quite fit into what we're doing with these types of companies. Granted, there are other groups who don't agree that fintechs should have their own charter, because the traditional banks have so many regulatory issues and things that they have to maintain to be able to operate. And then it kind of seems like, oh, well, the fintechs can come in and they don't have to go, the rules for them are not as strict. But that's kind of how it goes when we have new technology, we have innovation. When you want to be, especially the government wants to protect investors, but also protect consumers, people who are going to be accessing these systems, then they have to find ways that kind of work for both people that are participating in that system. But yeah, it is a very serious limitation. I don't know how you could really get around it unless you tried looking at the fintech charter maybe, or maybe figuring out how you could operate and not necessarily be in all states. I mean, obviously, if you want to be global, or if you want to scale, you have to hit as many target markets as possible. So it's a tough balance, if you will. I think it just really depends on what it is you're trying to do, and how do you think that what you're trying to do will really affect the different target markets you're trying to reach. Because I know that at the end of the day, everybody's trying to make money, right? We know the blockchain community is great, the crypto community is great. We want to invite people, but all of these people are entrepreneurs, right? Or startups. And so everybody wants to make money, and I get that. And obviously, when you make money, to be able to get a profit, you have to spend less than you make. So, I get that. I get that. But it's a tough business to be in. Finance, just generally, is a tough business to be in. It's expensive, regardless of what you're trying to do.
Thank you for a thoughtful and honest and brutal reply. And moving on from the crypto to tokenized securities topic, you also advise small businesses on crowdfunding, and the STOs, among others, emerged as the option for crowdfunding. So do you advise your client to use security tokens for this option? And do you think this is a viable alternative for
Yes, I
crowdfunding?
do. That's a great question. Yes, I do. So when I talk a little bit about when I do my presentations on crowdfunding, I always have a slide on tokens, because tokens are the best way to your customers and your investors. So I feel like I know that part of it is marketing, right? People like the idea of, if you say tokens, then you automatically think of blockchain or other types of innovative ways to raise money or to be able to participate in different ecosystems. But the token can really represent anything. And that's what's so great about it, right? And what that token represents and how it's used can also be flexible based on what your business model is. So Reg CF, or Regulation Crowdfunding Campaign, you can have a token represent equity, right? And then once that token is actually distributed, then that token can also either double, or you can provide another token that would provide access to your ecosystem. Let's say you are a restaurant or something like that, or maybe a service provider. The investors know that if they invest, in addition to being an investor and helping you raise capital, they also get some perks with being an investor, which helps you, the company, because then that investor, we talked about Anson Williams, he coined the term investomers. So investors and customers put together, they are like a great combination because they not only are they investing and consuming your product, but they're also telling other people about it, right? Because presumably when they bring more people on or bring more customers on, this is helping them in the long run because they've invested in your company. The other good thing about tokens that it is, as we know, it's digital. So many, eons ago, when you invested in a company, you got this piece of paper that said you are a stockholder, shareholder, et cetera. You have these class of stocks, et cetera. And these are the rights and everything that you have that come along with these stocks. But the token can represent your share, your ownership share, or your ownership interest in this company. And later, when you are either ready to exchange, sell, gift that asset to someone else, then it is a much easier and cleaner way to do that, as opposed to looking for this piece of paper that you've had, for 20 years, et cetera. So in terms of exchanges, it's a great way to get on a secondary exchange if, once those things start coming, because there are a few secondary exchanges trying to find their way in this market. But let's say that, we have the secondary exchange. As a result, you can go on there and sell this asset, fairly easily. That's the goal. So I think having these tokens is a way to build business, but to also set the company apart from, traditional businesses.
I do like the notion of having your investors, your customers, also your investors a lot. And I believe this is a future. And in terms of our business development, we're also trying to speak more to traditional companies as well, who can power up not only their fundraising, but also their customer relations, their loyalty programs with different kinds of tokens, that is transform all relationships with counterparty they have into a tokenized form. Totally, this is what tokenized business is, I would say. And
I agree. I didn't think about that.
And you mentioned also about secondary exchange. I do think that secondary market is one of the crucial points for the market to grow and move forward. And actually, the secondary markets for securities were centralized for quite a long time, but we have seen actually a few security tokens. I saw only 3 that are actually traded on a decentralized exchange on Uniswap. And on your opinion, is it possible for regulated securities to trade not on centralized venues, but on a decentralized exchange, which is not regulated and doesn't have a central listing operator and rules, given that there are some KYC procedures implemented?
That's a tough one. It's tough because I think people are really trying to make it work, which I appreciate. But at the same time, like I was saying earlier about when you have these different transactions and being able to know who the end users are, that I think is what gives regulators pause. The fact that there's nobody in the middle that they can go to and ask for records and all that. And then there's no one. And then even if they said, okay, we're going to go to this decentralized exchange, they wouldn't know either. Even if they could tell you, they wouldn't know, right? So I think it's possible, but I wouldn't say that it would be completely unregulated, because whenever money is involved, I don't think that the powers that be will let something like that go and not have some level of oversight. But at the same time, I think that decentralization right now, even though it's very popular, and it's also finding a way to make it's kind of growing up, if you will, from like simple transactions to complex uses and loans and different more sophisticated, if you will, financial transactions. I still think that it's in its infancy, because honestly, to create a DeFi or a decentralized exchange, or to have that type of business model, it starts out centralized, doesn't it? You know what I mean? You kind of have to put, corporate governance and rules in so that at some point it can operate on its own. But it still starts out as something where a group of people, co-founders, et cetera, board of advisors come together, and they are trying to find a way to make the rules and create governance measures that will eventually make it fair and accessible to everyone who wants to participate. So it's kind of like, it has to start out in the traditional sense, if you will, but then evolves into something greater and bigger. And that's what I'm kind of looking forward to just kind of see what that evolves into. I think there will be pushback. We know, right? There are going to be people on both sides pushing back to say this should happen, this should not happen, et cetera. But I think what's great about it is showing that traditional systems just don't work anymore. Or, and I shouldn't say they don't work, because there is a base of people who they will never leave the traditional banking system because they trust it, right? But at the same time, I think it really shows that there is a growing number of people who realize that the traditional systems, it has its shortfalls, and it's always good to have an alternative. And nobody says that you have to be one or the other, right? I think what's great about it is that you can, be part of this community in a way that makes you comfortable, but also be part of the traditional finance community, in a way that makes you comfortable as well.
Yeah, I hope at one point we won't be speaking about traditional finance and
Right.
crypto finance or tokenized finance. We'll have just all finance will be tokenized. And I remember when speaking with Samson, he mentioned that we won't be speaking about crowdfunding and STO because all crowdfunding will be in the form of security tokens. And I'm looking
Mm.
forward to the moment. And having another thing I like is having, when you speak about decentralization and having community own the business, and speaking back about our point of customers being your investors, your business exists to serve your customers. And basically, when your customers are also your investors, they also own the business. And this removes the inefficiencies that we have when the business exists to serve customers, but is owned by investors, which have different incentives. And when these are the same people, this is the corporate governance we need, I would say.
I agree. I think one of the benefits of, I guess, seeing like how these different communities come about and how even crowdfunding has, gained popularity. It's not that the law is not very old. It became effective in May 2016. But I agree. I think that we will continue to see founders and startups move away from, only seeking VC money to scale, and realize that if they can show traction and they can pull customers, then those customers can turn into or double as their investors, which I think, to your point, when the businesses then are making these, big decisions, they take into account the investors and the customers, and not just the needs of the people who put money into their bank accounts, right? Because like you said, the incentives are very different. The VCs, they want to, multiply their money by 100 times. Whereas the investors and the customers, they just want to see good products come out over time. You know what I mean? And so if you're thinking about community and thinking about support, who better to support your business than the people who already love what you're selling?
That's true. And actually, businesses are also going to VCs because they can provide expertise and
Mhm.
connections and this kind of support. But if you have, instead of 2 or 3 funds and specialists in them, if you have 1,000 people with different degrees and different connections, if you have them as investors, then your support is much greater.
Yes, yes. And I agree. I'm not saying VCs are bad. I do agree that VCs have their place in the capital raising structure for sure. But the other thing about the VC world is, and we've seen stories about people who are like, they've tried to pitch to this VC and that VC, and women of color just are not having their businesses vetted or even looked at by these VCs for a variety of reasons. But at the same time, you then see these women do these crowdfunding campaigns and they're raising money in like, a matter of weeks. So I feel like, and then all of a sudden now they're a little more attractive to VCs, right? So I think it's having a crowdfunding campaign can be one of two things when it comes to VCs. It can either be a way to show the VCs that you have market validity, right? That you have a target market, they love what your product is doing or what your service is. But then it could also be on the other side where, VCs, don't want to share that ownership interest with, a whole lot of investors. Even though when you think about how the investors come on into a crowdfunding platform, they do have ownership interests and they do have, certain class of shares or stocks. But in terms of, what rights they have in the business, it's not necessarily the same as like you, the founder, right? It's not not on the same level. So there are limitations to this ownership interest, but at the same time, you gain the target market as a means to kind of share what it is that you are selling and providing. I've invested in crowdfunding campaigns. Sometimes, they ask us to be part of, their beta testing, which is great, right? So like, I think it's one of those things that kind of, makes you feel part of the process because you want to see that person do well. And in addition to investing, you want to help them, if you can. So I think that's something that, yes, you might not have the expertise and the connections of the VCs, but you also bring something to the table, right? It's not just that you're there just taking in or using the service or the product. You're also contributing to the benefit of the business.
Definitely. Maureen, thank you for the fantastic interview. Thank you for the insights and energy you brought to our community. It was a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me. I hope we can connect again soon. Thank you.
Thank you and wish you all the best. Bye.
Okay, bye.